Անհոր եւ Որդու եւ Ոգու Սրբո ամեն Հավատքով գխոստովանի քեզի եւ գերբակեն քեզի անբաժանելի լույս միասնական սուրբ երրորդություն եւ մեկ աստվածություն լույսը ստեղծող եւ խավարը հալածող մեր հոգիներեն ցույց հալածե մեղքի եւ անկիդության խավարը եւ լուսավորե մեր միտքերը հաջիկով աղոթելու քեզի աշշամոն եւ ընդունելու մեր խնդրանքները եւ ողորմեկու արածներու եւ մեզվի բազմամեղներուս Amen. We confess with faith and worship you, all light indivisible, unified Holy Trinity and one Godhead, creator of light and dispeller of darkness. Dispel from our souls the darkness of sin and ignorance, and enlighten our minds at this hour that we may pray to you according to your will and receive from you the fulfillment of our supplications. Have mercy upon your creatures and upon us, manifold sinners. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Aro. So, I have the great pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight. Our speaker is Dr. Jesse Arlen, who is the director of the Krikor and Clara Zorab Information Center at the Eastern Diocese and a postdoctoral research fellow at Fordham University. He earned his PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at the University of California, Los Angeles, with a dissertation about the life and works of Anania of Nodek, the first abbot of Nodek Monastery, and the relative, teacher, and spiritual father of St. Gregory of Nodek. Dr. Arlen has taught classical Armenian at the University of Notre Dame and at the Dumbarton Oaks and Hill Museum and Manuscript Library's Summer Language program, and has lectured on medieval Armenian poetry and the Armenian historiographical tradition at St. Nersess Seminary. His academic studies on Armenian religious literature, manuscripts, and spirituality have appeared in a number of peer-reviewed journals. He is currently working on 2 projects related to St. Nersess Shnorhali, the first being editing Matthew Sarkisian's translation and commentary of a collection of St. Nersess's liturgical odes, which will be the second volume in the Zorab Center's Sources from the Armenian Christian Tradition series. And second, he is working with the primate of the Eastern Diocese, the Very Reverend Father Mesro Parsamyan, on a new translation along with a theological and spiritual commentary on Shnorhali's popular prayer of 24 stanzas, With Faith I Confess, Havadov Chostovanim, from which we just heard one of the prayers this evening. Dr. Arlen's talk tonight is titled The Poetic World of St. Nersess Shnorhali. And with that, I pass the mic to you, Jesse.
Thank you, Deacon Adam, and thank you everyone for being present here for the next lecture in this series. Does everyone see the screen okay? It's very nice that we're praying the prayers of St. Nersess Shnorhali to open and close the lecture, and I'm very excited about the translation and commentary that Father Mesrop and I are working on, but I'm not going to talk about that tonight. Instead, what I'm going to do is talk about the poetic world of St. Nersess Shnorhali. And if you see the schedule of the program of the series, the next 2 lectures after mine are going to look at specific poetic works of St. Nersess. Deacon Hovanes is going to talk about the Sharagan Aisoranjar, or Yerk song Aisoranjar. And Matthew Sarkisian is going to speak about the liturgical odes of St. Nersess. And so what I want to do is talk in general about the poetic work and poetry of St. Nersess Shnorhali in the broader Armenian literary tradition, and show how innovative it was and significant it was what he was doing. So Professor Irving talked last week about the life and context of St. Nersess Shnorhali, who is from this illustrious family that could trace their lineage back to St. Gregory the Illuminator. She talked about how he spent almost, as far as we know, his entire life around the monasteries and fortresses of Armenian Cilicia. And here I just want to show again briefly that lineage and show how you see all the names in bold. They were Catholicoses of the time. And everyone goes back to Grigor Magistros, a very important figure, who was St. Nersess's great-grandfather. And I'll talk about him a little bit in the significance of his contribution to poetry, and specifically religious verse. And so it's important to see how this is part of a tradition that St. Nerses is a part of, but is doing much with and advancing. So this is the place where St. Nerses lived, and there's the fortress of Hromkla around the green that we saw the beautiful pictures of, images of last week. Okay, so this is a list of the 13 major categories of poetic works that St. Nersess Shnorhali wrote, along with the dates, as far as we know, when they were completed. And if you were to compare this list with writers who became before him, what would be so striking about it is how much poetry he wrote. The Madhanataran recently published a 2-volume series of St. Nersess's works, and the first volume, which is almost 2,000 pages of double column, large print, large format book, is devoted just to his poetic works. And what's so striking about this is that this is published in a series that publishes all the Armenian writers starting in the 5th century and going up, they hope, until the 18th. And this is the first time you get a writer who has so much voluminous poetic work. And it really makes you think, looking back, why wasn't it the case that writers wrote in poetry before him? Or if they did, very uncommonly and just in very restricted circumstances, like for liturgical song and chant. We're going to talk about some of these works later. But to understand this in a broader perspective, we need to understand the place of prose and poetry in pre-modern Armenian literature. You think back to the beginnings of Christianity in Armenia and the invention of the alphabet in the early 5th century, we can see that whole process of inventing the alphabet and starting the translation movement, you remember, was an evangelistic mission. The alphabet was invented by a monk, the Vartabed monk, Mashtots, who was interested in translating the scriptures and theology, liturgical texts, etc., into Armenian, so that biblical, scriptural, liturgical content could be in the language that people understood. He was himself an evangelist and a preacher and a teacher, and he was frustrated by the fact that the scriptures that he was using were in Greek and Syriac, and he was having to translate everything orally on the spot to the people, and things just weren't going deeply because there was the language gap. And so the invention of the alphabet and the beginning of written literature in Armenian is a process that's associated with Christianization, evangelization, and Christianity. And what that meant was that writers turned to Greek and Syriac, which were the neighboring Christian cultures, to translate and then start writing their own works based on those genres. And what's very striking when you examine that whole range of literature is that almost all the works they translated and then started to write themselves were prose works. Theological and patristic texts, homilies, hagiographies, martyrologies, catechetical texts, theological texts, doctrinal, etc. It's only some of the liturgical chants that could qualify as poetry. So why would that be? Why could that be? Because it's not the case for other neighboring Christian cultures. There's a fairly developed tradition of early Latin poetry, Christian Latin poetry, Greek poetry. Syriac is known for its early poetic writers. Why were the Armenians so reticent about this genre and didn't seem to use it much? Well, in thinking about this issue, I've considered the broader situation and of literature and music and poetry in Armenian culture. And we have to understand how innovative and new Christianity was in the Armenian world at this time. Because while the literary tradition is just starting, there was a vast and very well-developed oral tradition. And that oral tradition was associated with the pre-Christian Armenian religion, which is a combination of traditional pagan sort of beliefs, also some Zoroastrian influence, and it's very closely aligned and similar with the pre-Islamic Iranian, Persian oral tradition and religious culture. And what you had there were these figures who were called gusans, which is a Parthian or Persian word, which basically means a poet, musician, or a minstrel or bard. And you can see in this image from a medieval Armenian manuscript some images of gusans performing on the various instruments that they would use, usually stringed instruments, but not only. And what if we look at these figures more closely, we have to read between the lines because sadly their works don't come down to us. They were oral and they were lost, and not just lost but suppressed by the Armenian Christian writers who were in competition with them. The gusans we can understand as singers of lore, merriment, and mourning. These were kind of their main topics. They performed at banquets, weddings, and funerals, mostly in noble courtly settings. And speaking about the tradition of gusans, the scholar Mary Boyce says, poetry and music, it is evident, were among the Parthians. This is Persians, but of course, this also applies to Armenian culture, which was very, very influenced by Parthian. We know Gregory the Illuminator was a Parthian, Catholicos Sahak, and many of the noble families were of Parthian origin in the Armenian world. They were sister cultures, you could say. So poetry and music, it is evident, were among the Parthians' greatest pleasures, and for them the two were indissolubly joined. Poet and singer is the same word. And these gusans were not merely entertainers, but transmitters of the oral epic traditions. A Parthian Manichaean text says that a gusan is one who proclaims the worthiness of kings and heroes of old. So they essentially transmitted the memory of the people about the great deeds of the past, of the great heroes, and also the religious beliefs and the cultural values of the society. And this was in contrast and in distinction to the new religion and values that the Christian monks like Mashtots were trying to promote and spread among the Armenians. And we hear in many of the histories in the Armenian tradition about how these gusans performed well after the Christianization of Armenia that we know happened in the 4th century. For example, Moses Horonatsi, who took great effort to discover everything he could about the pre-Christian past of Armenia, says, when he's talking about this one figure, Anush, he says that this thing that I just narrated is confirmed by the rhythmic songs or poetic songs that the inhabitants of the wine-producing district of Gochten have lovingly preserved, as I hear. These include songs about Ardashir and his sons, and they recall in allegorical fashion also the descendants of Ajdahag, whom they call descendants of the dragon, because Ajdahag in our tongue is dragon. And what's important here is just to note how these gusans were performing and narrating the pre-Christian pagan past, both the heroic deeds and also the ethos and the religious values and beliefs that came associated with that tradition. As far late as the 13th century, when Frege, one of the first non-clerical writers in the Armenian tradition, is writing, he's still talking about gusans who were still actively performing in the Armenian context. He says, for example, when you gave ear to evil, talking about people he's writing to, or were enthralled by a gusan, you should have been listening instead to the gospel or Isaiah or Paul. So this is a very common theme you see among Armenian clerical writers throughout the period, is they're trying to get the people to care about and be interested in and want to listen to and have their world shaped by Christian biblical content and not the content of the pagan singers, the gusans. And we see the same conflict and tension in the works of St. Nerses himself. And this is a very striking passage. It's from the colophon, which is kind of like an afterword to one of St. Nerses's most important works, Jesus the Son, Jesus Vorti, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But what's significant is you can see on the right that in the Armenian, this is written in verse, this whole 4,000 line biblical epic was written in verse, and it all rhymes. Yevmi haisvok achtana te chapavor pani besa, yevardakin gardzinema vorbes yevzerken aprotidia, and so on and so on. And what he says is, let no one find fault in this work I just wrote, because it is a metrical work, and consider it inappropriate like the Song of Aphrodite. For if the false, which only pretends, can become so beautiful by this means, meaning by means of poetry, how much more elegant will become my word of truth in the same form. So reading between the lines, if he's saying, asking no one to find fault with the fact that he's composing in poetry and verse, what it means is he's expecting people to find fault and take issue with that. And I think the most logical explanation as to why is that poetry and verse and song, poetic song, was so closely associated in the Armenians' minds with the pagan tradition that it was considered inappropriate for Christians to have that kind of content, to compose in that kind of form, because of the close cultural association with the ones that the Christians were in competition with. I think if we thought of our own times today, the only thing we could compare it to that could draw such a striking analogy is if someone came to an Armenian church and wanted to compose a sharagan, a church hymn, but wanted to use the genre of rap to do it. there's of course nothing inherently wrong or bad or sinful or anything about the meter or metrics of rap, but it's so closely associated in our minds with promoting values, a lifestyle, morals that we disagree with, that it would feel so off to people even to hear something done that way. And I think this is a little bit like the situation St. Nerses was confronting. But he defends himself on the grounds of the Bible itself. He says, how much more elegant would my word of truth, my true discourse be in this same poetic form? Like the Song of Solomon, that which is named Song of Songs, which depicts the love of the heavenly bridegroom for the virgin bride, or the Davidic Psalms. So he talks about these poetic writers in the Bible themselves who use poetry. It's not just a pagan thing to do that. Christian writers, biblical writers themselves use verse, and that's why I'm doing it. He lists a long list and then says, or the many others so well known, which were composed in metrical verse, not by themselves, but by the Spirit who moves in those it wishes. So also I etch this poetic work on paper for the delight of the philologist and the well-intentioned reader. So what we're saying here is that what St. Nerses is doing is very innovative, and there must have been a reason for it. And the reason is, as so far as I can tell, is that Gusan literature and those songs were so popular with people. And that was partly a result of the genre itself of poetry and song. Poetry and song is very accessible and delightful and pleasing to listen to. It's also memorable, it sticks in your head, and it captures people's hearts and interest. Theological, dogmatic works don't do that in the same way. People associate them with being dry, boring, uninteresting. And it was the case that most literature in the Armenian Christian tradition up to this point, written literature, was written by monks for monks, by clerics for clerics. There were very few people who tried to write things for the general population. And St. Nerses, what makes him so important and so significant, and one of the reasons why he's so remembered and so popular today, is he wrote things at a level and in a form that was accessible and able to be appreciated and learned by the people, by the general population. And this was intentional on his part, so that he could produce something that was as catchy and as popular and could overtake the popularity of the Gusan's works. And what's amazing is he was actually successful in that, like the people before him were not. And so he was absolutely instrumental in the popularization of the poetic genre among Christian writers. He was not the first to do so. There was Grigor Magistros and St. Gregory of Nodek, who he read deeply from, both of them. Grigor Magistros was his great-grandfather. St. Gregory of Nodek, he read and studied and promoted his works. So these are some of those early poetic works. Grigor Magistros wrote a biblical epic in verse. And of course, most of us are familiar with the works of St. Gregory of Nodek, his liturgical odes and litanies, as well as, of course, the great prayer book, the Book of Lamentation, much of which is composed in poetry or rhythmic prose. And this epic tradition, which Grigor Magistros was the first writer of, is very interesting, and we don't have too much time to talk about it, but it took off in the context of contest between the Christian and Islamic tradition, where Islamic scholars were criticizing the Bible because on the grounds that it wasn't as beautiful as the Quran. The Quran, of course, is in poetry as well, and it's beautiful, and much of it rhymes, and it's sung and recited, whereas the Bible is made up of a bunch of different works by different writers over different periods. It's kind of an anthology more than a single beautiful work. And so Grigor Magistros took it upon himself to take the contents of the whole entire Bible and put them in a 1,000-line verse of poetry to show that you can put the Bible into poetry. And these are the contents that he did, and this isn't so important to go into the details of, but he used this specific end rhyme, in, which is the most common rhyme in Arabic. And this became a very common rhyme used in Armenian as well. And so we can see the use of poetry, especially in St. Nersess, as a competition and an effort to promote Christian and biblical literature and content in competition both with the pagan Gusans as well as the Islamic tradition around which Armenians lived, and we know some Armenians were converting to. St. Nersess Shnorhali also wrote a biblical epic, which was this famous work, Jesus the Son, Jesus Vorti, and he chose the same end rhyme, in, that he used throughout the work, showing how he's specifically drawing on that tradition started by Grigor Magistros. And what's innovative about this work is, while Grigor Magistros wrote from kind of a distant bird's eye view, just sort of narrating the biblical events, in St. Nersess Shnorhali's work, he took the penitential, confessional, intimate dialogue approach of St. Gregory of Nodeg, who used that in his prayer book, where it's the individual speaking with God and speaking in a confessional and penitential way with God. St. Nerses took that and applied that in his biblical epic. So he's also narrating the biblical story, but he's putting himself into every situation and comparing himself with the figures in the Bible and using that as a way of speaking about his own inadequacy and his sins and repenting before God. And we can look at a brief example of that. This is the first printed edition of Jesus Vorti, done in Venice, I think, in the 17th century. And here's the opening. I just want to read a few lines in the Armenian so you can hear the rhyme and the rhythm, and then the English. Jesus Vorti hor miadzin, yev jarakait gerbaranin. Zenunt anjar eskisna debin, anhadapar kum zenohin. Horme yelyalkas nedkordzin, imanalik vorkirevin. Marmin yelyalkas yev an marmin, an panagan kanterts panin. It gives you a sense of the poetry of the Armenian. And the English of just the opening is, Jesus, the only begotten Son of the Father, and the splendor of his countenance. This is in a kind of older English translation that was done by Misha Kudyan. Thou ineffable offspring of the archetype, inseparable from thy begetter. Thou by whom all beings are created, the conceivable that can be seen, the disembodied and the embodied, the irrational as with the rational, the living things that grow and the lifeless that do not move. All these offer thanksgiving unto thy loving Father and unto thee, and unto thy coexistent Spirit are offered exaltations on high from the elect most pure that are admitted unto thine abode. So it also sounds very distant at first, but then look at how he narrows in and personalizes everything. Receive me also with them, O Lord, I who have disobeyed the commandment, I who am like unto the prodigal son and the waster of thy father's goods, who ignored the honor that came from thee and became the equal unto the brainless one, that put the whole herd of swine to graze in the very field of demons. I who am famished, not of hunger for bread, but to hear thy word, O Lord, being ardent with the desire for cherubs, in the bitterness from the delight of sins. And this is kind of the tone and way in which the whole work progresses. This is one of the most popular spiritual pious works in the Armenian Christian tradition, behind Gregory of Narduk's Book of Prayers. And there's actually 2 English translations that have been made of it that you can find. Looking at his other poetic works, I want to talk just very briefly about his liturgical songs and sharagans and liturgical poetry he wrote, but leave most of it for those who will speak after me in the next 2 weeks. But we actually have some historical content about why and when and the occasion for which he wrote some of those pieces. And it's very interesting and telling to read, going along with some of the things we were talking about before. So Giragos of Ganzak was a 13th century historian. He says this: the desire of the Saint Nerses was to devise a means such that no one would recite vernacular material not drawn from the scriptures, whether at drinking parties or other festivities. So St. Nerses wanted them to stop singing and performing the works of the Gusans. He says, for this reason, he composed melodies himself, meaning the music, the melodies himself, and taught them to those guarding the fortress, so that instead of idle chatter, they would chant that one whose beginning is the Psalm of David, I recalled your name, O Lord, in the night, and solemnly, each taking turns, awaken my glory, which now is chanted in church during the night office. So one of these chants, which now is performed in the night office, Hishasuk ikisheris anun koder, along with Zartik Parkin. These were originally composed, Giragos says, for the guards who were guarding the fortress, along with the melody he taught them, so that they would chant this while they're guarding the fortress instead of Gusan music or talking amongst themselves. So you can see already in this little snippet, St. Nerses's desire to get the regular people, not just the monks, but the regular people to be imbibing and ingesting and singing this beautiful scriptural content. He also wrote many, many liturgical odes, and Matthew Sarkisian is going to talk about these in 2 weeks. We're producing a translation of these, over 60 of them, which cover most of the feast days of the major feast days of the Christian calendar. And there's many variations on each of the feasts. And this will be a book that's both a published book and also an ebook, over 200 pages or so. And it's going to be, well, it won't be just like this, but it'll have English, the English and the Armenian, along with notes and scriptural references and commentary, so that you can study and appreciate and these great works, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks. Giragos talks about something else that is very, very significant, and it's that it's this little snippet here, which comes right after what I read before. He says, since Nerses was talented in every genre, he also composed enigmatic proverbs and riddles derived from the scriptures, so that people would recite those instead of pagan legends or fables at drinking parties and weddings. And so St. Nerses wrote these little 4-line, most of them are 4-line, riddles. And so that people would learn and use those. And what's significant about that also is riddles are very popular and catchy and engaging. It draws you in and makes you want to engage with them because there's a game and a puzzle to it. So his idea was, if I can put scriptural content into that form, it'll make it more appealing and engaging to people. And we see that in the kind of riddles that he wrote, and we can look at a couple examples. So here's one. He says, Desias manug mi vordzananer, yevinuin oren meraner. Head tagelwin tartial harner, eval keretzig zink tutsaner. Which means, I saw a young child newly born, who on the same day passed away. After being buried, he rose again and showed off his radiant beauty. And you probably know what it's about, and there's the answer given to all these riddles. And the answer to this one is the sun, S-U-N. It's the sun that every day is born, goes across the sky, and then dies, passes away on the same day, but is risen again the next day. And it's written in a way that it recalls and really speaks about Jesus, the Son of God, S-O-N, who, like the sun, died and rose again. And he uses the same word, harner, which is the root for rising, as in resurrection. And even all of Nersess's riddles that even are about, trees or the sun or sky, everything is written in a way that shows how it's related to Christ, or as a type of Christ, or somehow is connected with the spiritual mysteries, the Christian mysteries and beliefs. And the language is so straightforward. If you know modern Armenian and you read this, even though it was written so long ago, it's pretty much intelligible. The grammar is very simple. The words are very simple. And actually, many of these riddles, there's elements of Middle Armenian, which I'll talk about in a second. But here's a couple other riddles. Megig havuk mi gair pokrig, yevi kluchnuner savuk tabrig, yertair nester inken larig, agot karner chist sabergig. You hear all the eek. It's very colloquial, the style, not high literary. It's very much like almost like a rhyming nursery type sound to it. There was a small solitary chick on whose head was a black feather. He would go off and sit silently to offer pure and holy prayer. And this is about a Vartabed, a monk, so who is like a bird because in his thoughts and mind, he's soaring into heaven in his prayer and contemplation, and is dressed in black and has the hood over. So he's only focused on spiritual things and offering pure prayer. Or this one here, which is a biblical riddle, almost like trivia. So, Yergu hovi v'statsan v'char, Yuryan knein azad yachbar, Minen madar arner artar, Nuswin yerev bitzakahar. 2 shepherds had their sheep. They were each of them free brothers. One of them made a just sacrifice and was beaten to death by the other. So this, of course, is about Cain and Abel. Abel, who offered the righteous sacrifice, and his brother Cain, who murdered him out of envy and bitterness. And this is significant because he's perhaps the first writer, one of the first at least, who is in the clerical class and is using Middle Armenian, what's called Middle Armenian, which is a literary vernacular. So by the time of the 12th century, when he's writing, the spoken language that Armenians are using has changed so much from classical Armenian that you can't understand it fully unless you're taught in schools. And most people didn't go to those schools. And so they were increasingly distant from that high literary standard. And so he started to write these riddles in a form of the language that was closer to how people were speaking. And you see that in those riddles. And writers after him will adopt this much more and popularize it very much, especially when they're writing poetry. This is just to show that different kinds of Armenian. So that Kurapar classical Armenian from the 5th century was already so different from how people were speaking in the 11th and 12th and 13th. And so it's around that time you start seeing, especially after St. Nersess, people adopting more and more what's called Middle Armenian. And I think I was going to talk a little bit about, I think I'll just go very briefly over this other poetic work of his, which was also so significant in the Armenian tradition, which was a lament. He wrote the very first lament for the fall of a city in the Armenian literary tradition. And you remember we talked last time about how he was in the Kilikian area during the Crusader time. And so there's all this conflict back and forth between the Crusaders, the Armenians, and the Arabs who are there, and they're battling over the various holy places and cities in the region. And the city of Edessa was captured in 1144. It had been held by Christians, and then it was captured in 1144. And this was a calamitous sort of event from the Christian perspective, especially because Edessa was such an ancient Christian center. And Armenians celebrated King Abgar, who was the first Christian king who was converted by Thaddeus as an Armenian king, and had such close ties to the city of Edessa, Urfa. And when that fell, St. Nersess's brother was actually there when it fell, and his brother requested him, or his cousin requested him, to write a work about it. And so St. Nerses took the Book of Lamentations from the Bible, which is about the fall of Jerusalem, and he wrote a lament, again in poetry and verse, which is significant because it's about this tremendous emotional experience. And of course, poetry is the best form for conveying emotion to the reader. And so this lament he wrote became very popular and influential. And it's very moving if you read it. It also uses that same e rhyme for most of it. And it's told from the perspective of Edessa herself as the city, speaking and lamenting over what happened to her children, who are the population. And while St. Nerses, again, we see him so influential in the tradition. He was the first to write in this. After him, there were dozens and dozens of laments over cities written. This is around the time where there's a lot of invasion and shifting borders in the region where Armenians are living, and cities being captured or fallen, Armenians having to move, being exiled. And so later Armenian writers will adopt this same genre and model their own works written, writing laments for after the cities they lived in or cared about were captured or fell. And this is all written from a scriptural and a perspective of faith, which is to struggle and grapple with, what does it mean that your city fell? Does that mean God abandoned you? Or what was your role in contributing to the fall or the calamity that happened? And then remembering the promises of redemption and that God will never ultimately forsake or abandon us, and to reinforce faith in people. And that's where we can kind of end our talk here tonight. And just to, before we go to questions, which I'm eager to hear from you, or comments, just to reiterate how significant St. Nerses was, and how significant it was his adoption of poetry in the context of the Armenian literary tradition, which we can see, looking back from our perspective, was such a strategic and effective choice. And I think part of his popularity is due to the fact, and his continuing popularity till today is due to the fact that he had the vision to compose works in a form and in a way of writing that was accessible and able to be appreciated by a wide audience. And the use of poetry and the use of a form of the language closer to the vernacular people were speaking were two very instrumental parts of that success. And in the next 2 weeks, we'll get to hear, or to kind of dive deeper into specific poetic works of St. Nerses. Thank you, everyone, for your attention.
Well, thank you very, very much, Dr. Arlen. This was a wonderful evening. I really enjoyed it personally. So now we are going to close up with the closing prayer, which I'll be putting on the screen. Yev nishan yev badrastek, ramesek.
Բարին գամեցող դեր գամարար, թույլ մի դար, որ երթանք մեր անցին գամքին համացայն, այլ առաջնորդե մեզ քու բարեսեր գամքիդ համացայն լալու, եւ ողորմե քու արարածներուդ եւ մեզի բազմամեղներուս. Amen. Lord, director of the will, who wills that which is good, do not let us follow the inclinations of our hearts, but lead us so that we may always walk according to your good will. Have mercy upon your creatures and upon us, manifold sinners. Amen.
That concludes our session tonight. And as I have on the screen here, these are the upcoming sessions we have. So please join us next Tuesday, it's September 5th at 7 p.m. for the next session of our series. Thank you all for joining us and have a good evening.